Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. I greatly appreciate the chance to speak in this series. I wanted to present, and I should thank Louise for saying it was okay, to present a talk based on a paper that I did with one of my doctoral students who just completed her thesis. And she is interested in immigration, and I had been asked to do a paper for a companion to bioethics series, and our interests converged on this question about unauthorized immigrants. So I know this is a problem in many countries. What benefits should be available to unauthorized migrant workers? So given the passage of the Affordable Care Act, the American crude version of universal coverage in 2010, and it's being saved by the Supreme Court decision of this past spring. What we focused on was whether these immigrants should have access to insurance coverage through the Affordable Care Act. Let me give you a little background about this. And first of all, I want to emphasize that this is an ethical issue I want to pursue and not a political question, because there are good reasons to think one couldn't have achieved the results I wanted or we're going to argue for politically in the passage of the ACA. So I wanted that to be set aside for the moment. Maybe we can come back to it in discussion. And I wanted to focus instead on the moral issue. So there are some 12 million unauthorized immigrants in the United States, mostly from Latin America. And all of them have access to emergency coverage, medical coverage through an American law whose acronym is EMTALA. But there was another American law passed in 1996 that denied public benefits from federal services to all immigrants, all unauthorized immigrants, and that is not contravened in the ACA, in the Affordable Care Act. So this continues a practice which is not very old by policy standards, is only 15 or so years old. So what I'm going to argue for is that there is a strong presumption for coverage for unauthorized immigrants. I don't want to base my argument on appeals to concerns about global justice, and instead, or on appeals to human rights. Instead, I want to suggest that there are some reciprocity arguments and some concerns of social justice that I want to emphasize that support the view that these are unauthorized immigrants are members of society, members of a community, and should be protected in the ways other members of a community are protected. In addition, I want to suggest that there are no overriding reasons to exclude them, and therefore the presumption stands that they have some sort of basis in social obligations for protection. What I will need to suggest and defend is the judgment that most unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. are members of U.S. society. And that is a controversial claim. I agree. Nevertheless, the intuition I'm defending is that this is an important consideration, and it comes with something of a puzzle, because ordinarily we talk about protection of free and equal citizens in a society, and we're talking about all citizens. But unauthorized immigrants, even if you want to provide them with benefits, don't have a political voice in the system, in the construction of the obligations to provide those benefits, for example. And so I need to address the fact that the kind of theory I'm going to suggest they're protected by also would give them political voice. How does that get accommodated in this argument? And I want to set that issue aside and say, well, it's an issue for immigration reform. And that is kind of an ongoing negotiation right now in the US between proponents who wanted unauthorized immigrants to have a route to citizenship, which would give them over time a voice. And that is an important piece of the immigration reform legislation. So one way to look at what I'm going to argue for is that it actually strengthens the argument for immigration reform that includes a route to citizenship. Because if these unauthorized immigrants are entitled to benefits and voice, then there ought to be a provision for providing that within the immigration reform. So that's the thesis I want to defend. Now, a little bit of background. As many of you may know, there's been a long-standing flow of Latin American workers into the U.S. We had in the 1960s and 70s a lot of political activism focused on organizing migrant farm workers, who were mainly migrant workers from Latin America. So we have a long-standing controversy about how these workers will be included in American institutions such as the labor force. Starting in World War II, we had an official program called the Braceros program to produce guest workers in the United States who were mainly who were all Mexican. And this was justified on the grounds that we needed to replace in wartime factory workers and others who were thinned in their ranks by the service that they had to provide. So there were these Mexican field workers, for the most part, who provided these workers. And this program lasted until basically 1964, I think, or 5, when it was had run into a lot of criticism because of the exploitation of a lot of these farm workers and the Cesar Chavez organization organized efforts to produce union status for these workers so they could collectively bargain for their rights, was on the table, but the program was abandoned. Nevertheless, and they operated, this migrant worker program operated in a context where immigration to the U.S. had no quotas for Latin American workers all through this period. So we, in a sense, acted as if we knew that there was a large labor supply that we could use and take advantage of. This was encouraged, and the absence of quotas on the migrants from Latin America was part of a be friendly to your neighbors policy. Of course, we could look askance at some of the kinds of exploitation of the workers who came that took place. But nevertheless, this was a kind of open border to a lot of the immigration. There were no restrictions through quotas. Now, an important point about this pattern of immigrant worker from Latin America is that they tended to be temporary. There was not a large unauthorized stay of these workers. And indeed, the whole idea that they would be unauthorized wasn't true when there weren't quotas and restrictions. In 1993, however, we militarized or began the militarization of the southern border of the US. And arguments have been made by some sociologists like Doug Massey from Princeton that we, through this policy, trapped millions of immigrants in the US who would ordinarily have left. So we had only about 2 to 3 million migrant, unauthorized immigrant workers in the US as of 1993, but by the time the ACA was passed, there were roughly 12 million people. Why was the militarization border a key move? Well, it raised the costs of transit for a lot of workers. They had to hire these coyotes who exploited them, and sometimes they were killed in transit. And so the risks and costs of transit were vast. Many people who made it to jobs in the US would stay rather than do what they used to do, go back. So in a certain sense, American policy created the problem of unauthorized immigrants. It was intensified when NAFTA was passed in roughly in the same period, because NAFTA impoverished millions of Mexican farm workers, and they too were pushed to go get jobs in the US where they were still needed. The ironic thing about NAFTA was that it said open transit of all inputs to production except labor, which is a puzzle. How do you distinguish the labor inputs from the others? So the millions of Mexican migrant workers that were created in part by the NAFTA treaty added to the flow of migrant workers in the US. Now, just as a footnote, this flow stopped by 2012 as a result of the lack of the pull of jobs to the US, but also the intensified militarization and risk that the border posed to people. So people wouldn't come on the chance that they might find a job. Even if there weren't many jobs, they would realize that they had to cross an even more intensely militarized border. Now, I mentioned the 1996 law, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. These names all have an echo of 1984 to them. Basically, this law, for the relevant parts that bear on this problem, ended the parity of immigrants. So legal and unauthorized immigrants were now treated differently by the law. Legal immigrants could get entitlements to the U.S. benefits after a 5-year waiting period. That's a long time. But unauthorized immigrants were shut out completely. And that's the law that governed what happened in the exclusion of unauthorized immigrants from the ACA. So in effect, the ACA entrenched this non-parity of different classes of immigrants, so that unauthorized immigrants can't even buy unsubsidized insurance on the insurance exchanges that are supposed to be an expansion of access to care in the U.S. Remember, however, they are still covered by for emergency services. Now, one way to make the problem go away would be to support a claim about global justice that might take the form of saying there ought to be open borders. Everybody ought to be able to come and go as they want. And if there were open borders, then you couldn't distinguish unauthorized from authorized immigrants, and the whole problem would disappear. So that's a concern, because what I wanted to argue for was that, in fact, we shouldn't rest a defense of access on this kind of claim about open borders. And this comes from a couple of thoughts that I had, and I'll just put them out very briefly to you. There is a long-standing practice in social justice considerations to take the feasibility of a change into account in thinking about what the requirements of justice are. And we have two responses. Sometimes we'll say an unjust practice or situation is unjust even if we can't change it. So, for example, if we had a gender-biased or racist practice that was, we couldn't possibly get rid of it because the powers that imposed it were unmovable, reflected vested interests that we couldn't dislodge, we might still say what they were doing was unjust and the practice was unjust. Other times we might say if there's an injustice, it should change we cannot imagine people doing something differently, then maybe that's not a requirement of justice. We revise our considerations of what justice requires in light of what people are capable of doing. And I want to emphasize that point because I think it gives a content to the sometimes criticized notion that ought implies can. I can't be required to jump over the moon because I can't do it, nor can you. And if we had a picture of, or a view about what institutions could achieve, suppose we imagined that people shouldn't respond to incentives, and their responses were unjust, the incentives were unjust, but we didn't know, we couldn't change them. A piece of human nature is that people respond to incentives. Which incentives we give them is a matter of social policy, but the mere fact that people respond to incentives is a constraint on what we can introduce as a requirement of justice. So the picture I have is that we need to carry out a more careful analysis of which constraints of feasibility constitute grounds for changing the requirements of justice and which not. And there is no good systematic discussion of that in the philosophical literature. So the suggestion I want to make is that we ought to distinguish at least two notions of feasibility. Feasibility as achievability, do I know how to put something into place? And feasibility as sustainability, assuming that we had a practice in place and people could carry it out, is it sustainable? And I think it's the sustainability that captures a little more of the intuition that this is likely to be something that has to do with fundamental capabilities of people. People are able to do something, or institutions are able to be designed in a certain way, and that ought to be a constraint on social justice. So if something is infeasible because it couldn't survive, then that would be an argument against treating it as a consideration of global justice or domestic justice. And the particular application I want to make of this idea, which I haven't really fully defended, but just suggested, is that the notion of open borders is infeasible. It's infeasible because even if we had a global society or something like that, or a federation of states, and they all agreed that they ought to allow immigration across all borders, it's likely not to survive because people would organize themselves and oppose the loss of jobs or whatever in ways that were reasonable to expect people to do. Not, for example, on racist grounds, but these are real threats to my way of living or the ways my family has lived for hundreds of years. And there's a problem with that. Now, there are loose ends to be tied up, and I'm not going to go into the details of this, but I did want to suggest that this gives us one way to shut down the claim that we ought to have open borders and make the problem go away. Similarly, I think appeals to human rights won't work as a way of grounding the access of unauthorized immigrants. First of all, human rights claims are rights to emigrate from a country, not rights to immigrate into other countries. And it would be, you don't find any mention of a right to immigrate. The reason you don't is that countries would not have agreed to covenants and treaties which tied their hands behind their backs about regulating the flow of immigrant workers or immigrants, period. So I don't think right claims are claims to open borders. They're human right claims. They're claims to that countries can't stop you from leaving, which some do anyway. But nevertheless, and the Committee on Economic and Social Rights, that's what the CR there does, imposes duties on states. But it's a duty to progressively realize a right to health care. And the question, but there's no explicit remark from that committee saying that the progressive realization of a right to health means that unauthorized immigrants have to be included in whatever health care is provided in the country. Indeed, the argument in the US, the law requires that people not be given an immigration biopsy before being given emergency care at a hospital, and the argument would be that that is a pretty generous response to even unauthorized immigrants. So my view is that neither out of global justice nor human rights claims could we get a straightforward justification for access to care. Nevertheless, I don't want state authority to be complete, that is, to be absolute in this domain. I think the state has authority to regulate immigrant flow, but for certain reasons. And I don't have a full account of what the constraints on that are. On the other hand, I wouldn't go as far as saying whatever the states want to do is okay. And on the other hand, I wouldn't say states have no authority. So I've rejected the open border argument, but I'm not falling into the other camp of complete state authority. So let me turn to the two arguments in favor of presumption to care. One is pretty simple. It's an appeal to a pretty widely held notion about reciprocity. And it's the idea that if people contribute to the generation of a product that could lead to benefits to a population, they ought to be entitled to some share of those benefits. And it's pretty vague because it doesn't say how much of a share and so on. But the argument from reciprocity would apply in my view because most unauthorized immigrants to the US pay taxes and contribute work in a way that's productive to the society. And so on those grounds alone, I think they ought to be entitled to a share in the benefits that are produced by that contribution. So that's a pretty minimalist argument because it doesn't require very strong presumptions. The notion of reciprocity would be included in a lot of theories about justice. But I want to turn to a more controversial one. And this is a somewhat stronger claim, that most unauthorized immigrants are members of the community. Not only do they work and pay taxes, as was the point I appealed to in the reciprocity argument, but they participate in a broad range of institutions, schools, churches, and other things. And they buy houses, rent residences, and in a lot of ways they fit whatever sociologists would say constitutes membership in a community. So using a broader notion of membership in a community that comes from the broad range of sociological literature, I would want to include them as members. Now, the normative claim I want to make, not definitional claim, is that a principle that is at the core of Rawls's theory of social justice, a domestic theory of considerable prominence to liberal, more egalitarian societies like Canada, is that members of the community should be governed by the fair terms of cooperation in it. Now, when Rawls actually talks about this point, he talks about free and equal citizens. So my broadening of the notion to membership goes beyond citizenship. And this gets us a little bit to the problem that I raised earlier. Namely, in his theory, free and equal citizens not only are protected through the fair terms of cooperation, including a principle of justice, providing fair equality of opportunity for everybody, which is the hook that I want to use to include access to health care. But they also have certain basic rights and liberties that would be part of having a political voice in a society. And it's his argument is that we can get from the same structure of argument the defense of these basic liberties, including political participation rights, that we would give to the fair terms of other fair terms of cooperation, how we adjudicate the conflict between liberty and equality in a society, which he takes to be the fundamental problem of social justice. So on his view, the voice problem is also very central. And here I am trying to say, well, these are members of a community. They at least ought to have the benefits, but what about the voice? So that's the part I want to say should be covered by immigration reform. Meanwhile, we can talk about the benefits separately. So I'm making a move that some people may object to, but I think it's justifiable. So that's, in short, what my intuition is about membership. The unauthorized, and I'm not talking about everybody. I'm not talking about visitors, temporary visitors, and so on. I'm talking about long-standing unauthorized immigrants. People who embed themselves in a society, take jobs, work in schools, and so on. on what grounds could you possibly deny them membership in the community, or the features that come with it, which would be a set of benefits. So I mentioned this hook that I give, that I suggested. So among the fair terms of cooperation would be a principle protecting equality of opportunity in the society. So that I take that to be a widely held view. Maybe not always lived up to in practice, but certainly avowed. People may deviate from some of the protections of opportunity that they give. For example, we have vastly increasing inequalities in income and wealth in the U.S., and that's going to infringe on social mobility through various mechanisms in the U.S., and I would argue that's restricting the range of opportunities of millions of people in the United States. And that would be put forward in the same breath as people talking about protecting opportunity, the opportunity to become rich. So we have an avowal which is often not lived up to in practice, because if you try to dig down deep and see what protecting the opportunities of people would mean, it would mean something other than decreasing social mobility in this society. So what is the connection between health and opportunity? Because that's an important point. And that is, I think of health as being, or ill health, let's say, as diminishing the range of opportunities open to people because they lose certain functions or shorten their lives in ways that make it less reasonable to pursue different plans of life or exercise different opportunities that they might otherwise have if they were healthy. So the picture I have is that if we want to protect normal functioning of people in a society, we have a grounds for doing that by this social justice concern for equality of opportunity. So the picture I have is not that health is the be-all and end-all of opportunity, but that it makes a limited but significant contribution to protecting that. For those of you in a school of public health, this is, I think, an important issue. What are your grounds for being so concerned about health? So this is my attempt to answer that question. I think everybody in the field ought to have a view of why they think it's important to promote population health. And the account I'm giving suggests that we have two dimensions to our concern about protecting opportunity by protecting health. One is we want to improve population health, and that's been a traditional concern of public health. But we also want to distribute that health fairly in a population, and that has been an emerging concern of public health, only in, let's say, the last couple decades. So this is a view that says we have reasons to promote population health because it promotes the opportunity range of individuals in that society, but it's also a principle that says we have to pay attention to equity in the distribution of opportunity and also health. So this is a theory that addresses both of the dimensions of public policy. So let me, what I've tried to sketch is arguments for the presumption of inclusion of an obligation that we have to provide access to health care through insurance to long-standing unauthorized immigrants. What about some of the reasons that are often cited to exclude them? So one argument we often hear, I think, begs the question, and this is an argument, well, there's no legal claim to give them access to health care. We don't have a law that requires. But this is an argument about what the laws ought to be, not what they are. So I want to just set that aside. A much more common sort of argument is that, well, unauthorized immigrants are engaged in illegal acts. They're like criminals. Why should we owe them anything? And I think this is a real overstatement of the issue of what's involved in overstaying a visa, or even pursuing opportunities across a border, like your parents did. This is a, and indeed, the idea that you take away health care benefits from people, we don't take it away from murderers and rapists, so why should we take it away from unauthorized immigrants? They've only committed what in the US context is a misdemeanor. It's not even a felony. And yet we're denying them a benefit that we provide to mass murderers who are in jail. So there's something weird, in my view, about this reason for excluding people. Perhaps less weird argument is the claim that if we did authorize them to get benefits, we'd be creating bad incentives. People would come to get those benefits. I just note that in the period after people were officially denied the benefits in 1996, we had a vast increase in the number of people who came because of NAFTA and so on, and the militarization of the border, and became unauthorized immigrants. So if it was bad incentives that we did away with in 1996, we should have seen a decrease in people coming to be unauthorized, but we saw a vast increase. So maybe this isn't an empirically grounded objection, it's a speculation. The undue cost consideration, yes, there are costs if you cover people. I don't think one ought to deny that. Are they undue? Well, they're not more than you would cover other members of the society for, because we know two things about immigrants. Immigrant groups is there's a healthy immigrant effect. And indeed, there's a tradition of not utilizing services at the same level. So there are a couple of factors which push the utilization rates down and thus the costs down. And so the argument that you'd be opening the floodgates to a bunch of unhealthy people is just not true. Emergency care is sufficient. Well, should we give them more? Is another argument that you sometimes hear. And there the problem is that emergency care means unreimbursed care for many institutions. There are a lot of reasons to say if we could incorporate the health care of more people in the society who would otherwise be burdensome to the unreimbursed care system, that would be a better solution, because we would be in some ways transferring the burden of financing that from the sick to the well, and rather to particular institutions and public budgets that pick up the unreimbursed care. So that is all independent of the fact that sometimes, and for some conditions, the borderline between emergency medicine and other care is not very clear. And we have people with chronic conditions in a serious acute phase of illness. What does stabilizing them mean? I think the argument that has the strongest empirical basis is the one about some impact on vulnerable groups. So if you take particular groups of low-skilled workers who are in competition with unauthorized immigrants, there is some evidence, not overwhelming, I would argue, some evidence that there might be a negative impact on those vulnerable groups. Whether that warrants the conclusion that that's a ground for excluding people from healthcare benefits it strikes me as something that really needs discussion and an assessment, a careful assessment of what the level of evidence is and whether it actually justifies exclusion. I don't think it does. So my conclusion is that we don't have good grounds for excluding people. We have a presumption to include that comes from the reciprocity argument and the membership argument. It doesn't come from a global justice or human rights argument. This argument is limited. It applies only to most unauthorized immigrants in the US. It doesn't talk about recent unauthorized immigrants. Are they members of the community or not? I don't know what I think of that. But if we're talking about 12 million people, that is a huge population that is excluded from coverage and is the bulk, arguably, of the gap that remains in insurance if one fully implements the ACA. So my view is that the most covers most people who are involved. Is this a clean argument that automatically includes anybody with that status? The answer is no. I really was focusing on patterns that one has to extract from a broad set of behaviors. So let me stop and take questions.